You guys are amazing, and you guys are.
What else?
You guys got that momentum generation. Is that coming up? Is it already out? What's the deal?
That's out. Yeah, that was released at the end of last year in the United States by HBO and internationally by Universal.
Cool. And what is it about for those who are just going to get to you guys?
Momentum Generation is the story of Kelly Slater, Rob Machado, Shane Dorian, and the whole, what they called the momentum generation of surfers that grew up together. They stayed at this one little house in Oahu on the North Shore at Benji Weatherly's mom's house. So it was this probably 20, 30 kids sleeping on the floor of this house, learning how to surf the big waves of Hawaii together. And then they went on to become the foremost, surfers and athletes of of all time in the surf world. So it's their story about their friendship, the ebbs and flows of how their history's been.
How important is the music in this story?
Music's crucial in all of our films, even the ones where it's not forefront. We made a policing film last year that followed 3 police officers and 3 residents in the highest crime, highest homicide rate city in the United States for a few years in a row, which is East St. Louis. And it was intentional that the music wasn't in your face and that you weren't aware of it, but it played just as big a role emotionally. We spend a tremendous amount of energy on the music and everything we do. What's particular about Momentum Generation is that the music is a part of the story. They influenced their rise. Taylor Steele, who's the filmmaker who captured the early days of this crew rising up and competing, also combined the release of his films, his surf films, with performances by up-and-coming rock groups at the time, and he both put the surfers on the map and also put some of the musicians on the map. So we wanted to make sure we use some of that in the film. And there's a couple tracks in there, actually. Little known information here. A juicy tidbit is that Mike and I wrote a couple of the songs. Mike sings on one of the songs.
Oh, dude!
We actually,
you sing?
For the first time, we got a inquiry via email from somebody who said, "What's that song, man? I want to buy it. It's so rad. It pumps me up every time I go surfing. I want to download it."
And it was by the Zimbalist brothers.
Yeah.
Man, you guys do everything. Renaissance kids.
Yeah.
You guys do all kinds of things. What makes you gravitate towards the 90s as this essential part of Momentum Generation? I guess my question is, when you approach a story, what makes you passionate about it? What is it? What is it that you look for in a story?
Yeah, I think it's something different every time. With Momentum Generation, we grew up in the 90s. A little spoiler alert on our ages. So we remembered these guys, and we certainly remembered, the punk rock scene that kind of took hold of the U.S. during those days, that these guys were so integral in shaping. They went on all these tours where they'd be playing with the punk rock bands. So that was kind of a part of the fabric of how we grew up. But as far as what really drew us to the story, I will admit that there was a part of this story. We had been shooting, films like the one in East St. Louis, where we're, riding along with cops and in very dangerous neighborhoods, filming in, developing countries around the world and semi-sketchy locations. So one of the first things we're like, so we get to go film on beaches and beautiful places? That doesn't sound so bad. But this particular story, I think, grabbed us because it was really that story of these kids staying at that house together. And we had never really heard of, you hear stories about how all these sort of great icons sometimes come together in a certain time and place, but you never have access to the footage of when they were all unknown and just starting to, cut their teeth together in their chosen field. So we had this great resource in the filmmaker that was filming in that house, Taylor Steele, who gave us access to his storage units of unmarked tapes. I think our first trip we shipped over 500 pounds of tapes that had no labels on them whatsoever.
Whoa.
That our team then had to pour through to find all the gems in the film.
Wow, that's a lot of tapes.
Yeah, man.
That's a lot of tapes. I want to talk about writing because I love writing, but I find it so hard. Yet, I'd like you to take me through the process of writing a doc. What's it like nowadays? What's the hardest thing for you guys in the whole process? Is it writing? Is it editing?
I don't know if it's the hardest. It's certainly one of the most important, and something that we probably put more energy into and grapple over more than a lot of filmmakers do. We have done some scripted work in the sort of long form fiction realm, and Mike comes from acting, and so we take what we've learned of 3-act structure and character arcs and writing formula from that world, and we try to apply it to our docs. And often that means trial and error, and sometimes there's a lot of drafts of that until we make sure it's right. And that's true both at the early stage when we're preparing for interviews. We prepare these gigantic documents that have footnotes and references and research that adds up to over 100 pages in some cases, and then out of those outlines are built the questions for the interviews, and then out of the transcripts for those interviews we build a paper edit, which is basically the whole film on paper. And then from that paper edit we do edits, we test them with focus groups, we get feedback, we rearrange it, we take it all apart again, put it back together, and one of the most valuable parts of that process, I would say, is being willing to kill your babies, as they say in English. So let go of stuff that you were attached to that you thought was going to work, but the feedback you're getting is that it's not going to work, or that if you get rid of it, then something else will work better. It's all a big Rubik's Cube. So if you're willing to let go of something that you're attached to for the sake of something else having more emotional punch, then that's a sophisticated choice.
That connection between the reality of things and the skill that it takes to create a fiction work and reality TV, and how it has influenced the way documentary makers have evolved over the course of 15 years, and how powerful the documentary as a form has become. How does it work? Do you think reality TV plays an important part in the way documentary has boomed?
It's interesting. I think lately what we've experienced, at least in the United States marketplace, is that buyers are less and less interested in straight reality. More and more it seems, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but I'll pretend to be, that the audiences for reality has kind of narrowed and gotten pigeonholed, and they've got their shows that, okay, the buyers know we're going to give them what they want. But then there's this increasingly large audience that's moving over from scripted shows and scripted films that have interest in documentaries, but they're not interested in sort of schlocky, formatted, or reality TV.
Yes, easy stuff.
Easy stuff. They're demanding more and more highbrow, premium type content. So it's a great time to be a documentary filmmaker in that regard, and it really feels so separate. I mean, when we go in and we meet with our friends at Netflix or HBO, ESPN, you name it, they have different departments entirely that'll deal with reality and food shows, and so that doesn't even really have to cross your radar when you're doing elevated content.
Yeah, Bryan Cranston said something at the Emmys over the weekend that caught my attention, and that is so very true, and that I used to say to people once it started appearing on the media from analysts and stuff, and he said TV has never been any better. It's never been a better time for TV.
It's never been a better time for Bryan Cranston.
That's what that means.
he's had quite a ride. Yeah.
But isn't he right in the sense that?
I think we could say the same thing. We're in a great place in our careers. We're very fortunate. So yes, it's a great time in the industry for us as well.
Because it's like you see really good fucking TV going on.
The audiences have, for the most part, are being treated as smarter than they maybe were in the past. The storytelling is more nuanced, especially with the rise of scripted television as series. There's more complexity and layers to the characters. There's more weakness to our protagonists, and there's more strengths to our antagonists. It's a more intelligent storytelling time. And in the doc realm, there's the rise of sort of the crime series, which some of that does lean a little bit more towards the reality programming that Mike just commented on, that we're not big fans of. But a lot of it is really good investigative journalism that elevates both the storytelling and also advances the research from where it was in the past.
I think part of what's been happening is that you have so much more in the world of content providers that consumers have so many more options right now that the traditional providers are starting to get a little scared about just delivering the same old content over and over, knowing that their customers are starting to move over to other platforms that are taking more risks, that are being more disruptive. So suddenly you have buyers now who actually want you to push the limits. You come to them with an idea and it might sound like a perfectly good commercial idea to you and to them, but that's not enough anymore to draw away a customer from their competitor and put it, on their service. So I think that's also driving, television in particular, but also film and shows to break boundaries so that, I come to you and I say, Alejo, you got to see this new show. They're doing this crazy thing I've never seen before.
Definitely. Yeah. When it comes to music and to the remastered series, how did the idea come about?
So over the years, we've traveled a ton with our productions, and we've often been curious to learn cultural phenomena that are regional or local, and a lot of the goods or stories that rise to the top are related to music, and we started to notice that there was an overlap with the world of crime. And so we collected those stories over the course of more than a decade, and we're always in the back of our minds playing around with, are these one-offs or do they go together? Is there enough for a series here? And we hit a period right after Pele was released where we were putting together a new slate of projects, and we knew Netflix didn't have a marquee music documentary series. There's a couple other buyers that didn't as well. And so we figured it was the right time to bring all those stories from the past together, do additional research, put together a deck. We had, I think, over 80 stories listed in that deck, and we said there's multiple seasons here, and we put together a sizzle that showed the look and feel of what we'd be going for. A lot of our documentaries are very archive heavy, and so this was right up our alley in that respect, and went in and said, this is the intersection of crime and music. This is an investigative marquee documentary music series. Do you want it? And we were really excited to collaborate with Netflix on the first season.
It took you 10 years to pull that off? Wow. That's a lot of work, man. Because when you get to that project, when you get to the screen, when you go look for it, when you get the marketing push of it, and you say, okay, the remastered thing, I'm interested in it because I'm a music fan and the whole thing, you figure, it's just there. As a consumer, you just you just enjoy a good story.
The blood, sweat, and tears that went into it for all the people that worked on it.
Yeah. And how the idea evolves and turns into a reality.
Yeah.
Which is, once again, going back to the writing part and the whole process of creating things and being a part of a creative community, no matter where you are, whether you're in music, whether you're in movies or series or TV or podcasting, it seems as though it is really easy to get there. For the consumer, it's just there to enjoy,
Yeah, well, that's what it should feel like, I mean, you probably wouldn't enjoy it as much if you knew what we had to go through to make it.
Just the director's commentary is us complaining over the entire thing. I'm so tired.
Yeah.
Man, am I worked, burnt out over here. No one's gonna watch that.
I was on like 2 hours of sleep when we edited that. I don't even remember it.
Yeah.
Which one was the hardest of all the chapters?
Of the remastered?
Well, I'd say the most culturally delicate was the lion's share.
Marley?
No, the lion's share is about the song "The Lion Sleeps Tonight." The original author, Solomon Linda, died a poor man in the Soweto slums in South Africa, even though his song that he wrote went on to earn over $17 million in royalties for its use in The Lion King and many other big albums and covers that made it to #1 on the pop charts. And we told the story of a journalist who was trying to uncover what had happened, how did those rights get stolen. So it's in the format of a heist, like a robbery, and that was tough because it was about race. It was about it was about the racial history of South Africa. At the same time, it was tracking a song, and it's an environment that we haven't spent that much time in South Africa. So culturally, it was a delicate one. And then there were some that were just plain out dangerous, like the Marley one and the Jam Master Jay one and Who Killed Jam Master Jay. So there's some that they each had different challenges in different ways.
Do you arrive to a conclusion when it comes to those particular crimes or those particular situations? In the case of the Marley thing, like what's your main conclusion as fans and as investigators as well, as researchers?
I mean, in this particular series, we were fortunate to structure the production in a way where we had months in advance to work with these real crack investigative journalists who were, on the ground doing the hard research to figure out what we could find out in advance. Now, of course, in very few cases did they actually find out everything that we ended up finding out during production, because they weren't filming interviews and so on. But we had a elaborated outline that we all worked on in advance of actually green-lighting production, and Netflix had to sign off on it. So by the time we really got into the field, we already had a lot of very new journalism about that subject, and that helped propel the story. In some cases, there is a definitive conclusion about the mystery that the film is looking into. In others, we try and put forth as much as we were able to find out, which might point very clearly to a conclusion, but as journalists, it's not our job to make that statement. You leave the audience to make it for themselves, and the hope is that in any of that spectrum of endings, that it's a satisfying experience for the audience. So from the writing perspective, if the conclusion to who pulled the trigger isn't as conclusive as you feel maybe it should be, you start to find that the narrative of the story takes a different emphasis, so that by the end you're maybe more compelled by, like in Jam Master Jay, the end of it, even though it does point some fingers to who might have been involved, there's a larger societal question about the police's involvement, society's involvement, particularly in the murder of hip-hop artists, and we draw the conclusion among many other past cases that hopefully becomes the more satisfying conclusion for the audience than the whodunit of the mystery.
And in that sense, I want to ask a question that's maybe a bit tough, and doesn't have anything to do with your career, and it's about the Michael Jackson doc. What that felt like for you guys as documentarists and as TV producers, researchers, and journalists. What's your take on the Dan Call thing? On his take, on his look on things?
I haven't seen the film.
You haven't seen it?
I haven't seen it yet.
I haven't watched it. You haven't watched it? Oh my God.
Maybe you should give your take, Aleo.
Yeah, well, my take is that I've been such a big Jackson fan for all my life, man. I was a Jackson fan ever since I was 5 years old, and it's hard not to say that he didn't do those things, I saw Dave Chappelle on Sticks and Stones.
Yeah, much I saw. Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago. That was so, it was outrageous but so hilarious. And he says he thinks he didn't do it. I don't know if he's saying it just for the sake of the joke.
Right.
But to me, he was guilty, man.
Yeah.
He was guilty as hell. Even if Dan, the director, he goes all in because it's the two kids. It's a long. It's a 4-hour interview of those two guys.
Right.
So it's pretty hard not to see him as not guilty.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah,
we haven't seen it, so I wouldn't be able to weigh in, but it's been a really interesting phenomenon to see how culturally people react to the fact that there's this documentary that, from everything I've heard, seems to give people a very clear idea that he was guilty of what he was accused of. And then how do they respond to this massive cultural phenomenon that is Michael Jackson and his music? And it begs questions about other artists that have been uncovered recently for doing things, and how are we supposed to respond to their music from there forward? Yeah,
because I had kind of the same feeling when you guys did the Victor Jara one.
Yeah.
The one on Victor Jara really raised some questions. My family and I was brought up in a family that listened to Victor Jara quite a lot because my parents belonged to back then the revolutionary groups in Colombia, and Jara was an inspiration. And those interviews that took place with this man in Florida kind of gave me the impression that he was a part of it, that he was the man who pulled the trigger, that he was the man who killed him. But sometimes I just didn't know how to judge it, you know? What do you guys think? Did he do it? Did he not do it?
It was a tug of war throughout the process of making that film, just amongst, in our own heads, but also amongst our team, because there were some moments where he felt like he was a victim, and then there was a lot of other moments where what he was saying didn't feel like it added up. One way or another, we were going after evidence from the beginning. It wasn't enough that this was the first interview with the alleged murderer or the guy who gave the orders to have Victor Jara murdered. We needed to try to find something that was more tangible and concrete. And so that was why we went back down to Chile and spoke with a number of the other military officials that were working under Barrientos during that time. And it was through their testimonies, I think, that it started pointing a little bit more towards Barrientos having a role. Whether or not he pulled the trigger, whether or not he actually said, "Here's the order to go pull the trigger," we didn't actually solve it to that extent. But I think there's a lot suggesting that he was involved at the time, and maybe he's telling the truth, and maybe he's not telling the whole truth. And that's sort of one of those moments, like Mike said, where you invite the audience in to draw their own conclusions about what side of this very complex human drama they fall on, right? Unless we're going to solve it in a manner that a court can gavel down and call a final verdict on, we can leave that question open and make sure that we're trying to be as persuasive as possible on both sides of that debate.
If you had to pick between the documentary research, the investigative kind of thing that you guys do on docs, and fiction storytelling, if you had to pick between those two, which one would you pick?
It's such an unfair question, but I appreciate you asking it. We've decided to solve that problem by working on some hybrids that are doing both documentary and scripted in the same space. So right now we're launching a couple projects, and this is just one of those things, again, where because buyers are facing such competition to get the eyeballs of the public on their platforms, they're being pushed to do more and more, innovative and risky type content. And suddenly this whole new medium of hybrid scripted documentary projects is taking flight. And so that's something that's very inspirational for us, having worked in both. There's certain, I would say the real answer comes from the story itself. Sometimes we're brought a story and people say, oh, we want to, fictionalize this and script it and get actors. And we say, but that's a phenomenal documentary. And in fact, it's going to be more impactful to tell that story with the real people who are alive and well and can participate. Why wouldn't you want audiences to see the real thing? In other cases, we're given a proposal to do a documentary on a real story, and we say, well, there's no footage that exists. There's, most of the people involved are now dead, or, whatever the case may be, and we say, but it's a brilliant story, it should be scripted. And sometimes you get a story where it's like, it should be both.
Okay. I got one last question to ask both of you before I let you go, and thank you very much for being here. The 30 for 30 Escobar storyline. Americans are known for keeping it simple in many senses. In the entertainment, storytelling field, they're really good at keeping things simple and going with an idea which sounds pretty logical for Colombians, and is to cross-reference these two icons of Colombia from the end of the 20th century. It's a pretty simple idea that nobody but you guys came up with. Laura was telling me on DMs on Instagram that much of the passion, much of the idea of Escobar, Americans owe it to you guys, to that particular 30 for 30 story. The way the other Escobars that have been narrated on TV for America, coming from Colombia or from Latin American productions, is owed to that particular storyline. For us, the Escobar thing is so delicate, so touchy-feely, man. It's hard to come to grips with the idea that he became this pop culture icon.
Right.
He became this huge thing, and when Escobar makes waves in TV in the U.S., people down here get really outraged.
Yeah, as they should. Yeah.
They get. What's your take? You know, how do you deal with a figure such as Pablo Escobar when you cross-reference it with someone like Andres Escobar, and when you create this phenom in American audiences?
Yeah, we find it equally problematic when Pablo Escobar is only celebrated. When his story is told as this amazing rise and this classic gangster saga, we don't feel comfortable with that portrayal either. What we were going for in the two Escobars was a portrayal that both told the side of his story from the point of view of a victim of some of his violence, for example, as well as from the side of the story for somebody who was a beneficiary of some of the Robin Hood generosity that he did in some of the slums, some of the poorer neighborhoods, particularly in Medellin. Ultimately, he's responsible for thousands and thousands of deaths, and there's nothing worth celebrating in that stat. But there were little moments in his life where he contributed to particularly those groups and those demographics in interesting ways.
Kind of like a Robin Hood.
Like a Robin Hood, colombiano, and he also played a really intricate and complex role in the rise of football, or narco football, during those years. So we were interested in telling a layered, giving the audience a layered portrayal of who he was as a person, where for maybe 10 minutes at a time, they actually are kind of rooting for him and Nacional and his team and his players, and then for the next 10 minutes you think he's an evil monster murderer who's, is the most immoral person you've ever met. And that tug of war, that push and pull, hopefully the audience gets invited in so that they could start to question some of their own allegiances.
Yeah. Cool.
And I'd just add, we had really fallen in love with Colombia mainly because of the culture and the people while we were making that film, and it became...
Did you guys live in Medellin?
We have an apartment in Medellin, so
you do?
we're mostly in Los Angeles, but we're back and forth.
Okay.
But it became increasingly important in telling that story because of the delicacy, not just of the subject matter, but what Pablo Escobar has meant for the national identity of Colombia, particularly when you ask foreigners what they think about Colombia, and they got an Escobar, influenced image. So it became important for us to have that story represent the Colombian people that we had come to know and love that weren't involved in any of the delinquent acts of Pablo and others. And so for us, the legacy that's really been rewarding is when people watch that film from outside of Colombia particularly, and come to us and say, it gave me a very different picture of my Colombian friend and what he must have gone through, and the sort of hardworking people of Colombia and their spirit, their spirit, and how that's come through. And I have a much more positive image of Colombia. I think that was the most rewarding thing for us about that film, and certainly the legacy that we wanted to leave. And I honestly don't think that that's the film that gave rise to all these Pablo Escobar
glorifications and senses.
Yeah, I think that Al Capone's going to continue to have movies made about him. Any gangster of that scale, there's always going to be a facet in society that tries to celebrate that.
It. Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. I gotta let you guys go because you gotta keep on doing the conference circuit here at Colombia 4.0. But I gotta say, it's been great meeting you.
Likewise.
Take good care, and all the best for 2020, man.
Thanks, Alejo. It was fun being here.
Muchas gracias. Un gusto.
Thank you.
Hey,
Thanks.
take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Este programa fue financiado a través de los recursos del Fondo para el Desarrollo de la Televisión y los Contenidos de la Autoridad Nacional de Televisión.